Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches.
Good morning or good afternoon. We welcome you all to this session of dialogues and discussions on cities and human settlements free of discrimination. And thank you very much for being here, contributing to this that we see as a collective process for learning. I'm Lorena Zárate, and I we support the global platform for the right to the city, and with Manuel Demert from CLACSO. So we are going to facilitate and coach these sessions. That we are going to have 3 presentations during the first hour, and then we're going to open for a couple of rounds of discussions and Q&As with all of you. So this cycle of presentation, let me just give me a little bit. So I think you can see my presentation and you can hear me clearly. So prior to getting into the content, I'd like to tell you that, of course, from now, you can use the chat to introduce yourself, say hello, where you're coming from, and for putting questions and comments during the session. In the second hour, we are going to open, we are going to use to discuss if you want it. And this session has a simultaneous translation for Spanish and English. It is here indicated in Zoom. You can select the language, and when you select another language, please, you mute the original audio in order to have a better sound quality. So that's all. Thank you very much. Now in English. I don't know, we've got people speaking in English now from other regions.
Support team, and together with Manuel Damet from CLACSO, we're going to be co-facilitators and moderators of this session. For you, most of the session will be in Spanish, the presentations, so you can access English interpretation at the left bottom part of the Zoom window. We said interpretation English, and we suggest you can mute the original audio to avoid interference. So we podemos pasar entonces a la siguiente.
So let us go forward. So let me give you a little introduction of why we having this workshop, this session, and the agenda for today. So after a small introduction, we're going to have 3 different presentations. The first 2 of them are of articles that were included in our workbook, the Right to the City in face of the current challenges, that we coordinated together with the CLACSO team during the whole year. And 2 of those articles or thematic papers have to do with works in the metropolitan area of Lima and Quito. The first one by Jazmín, Goicochea, and the second one by Espinosa, that will tell us about their contribution, Ignacio, Espinosa, and Jazmín, Goicochea. And the next part, we're going to have a presentation of 3 people from the DESC Observatori from Barcelona that are working in one of the many different thematic articles, papers that we are pushing from the platform exactly on this subject matter from CTC and human subjects free of discrimination. So here we are they are going to show us a draft of what they are collectively working with. And then in the second part, Manuel then is going to make the dialogue and the interaction with all of you. So the next slide, please. So, in order to have a snapshot of what we're going to talk about, I told you that we are using this series of dialogues and discussions. The next week, I'm going to have another session to link the work that we've been doing in this workbook together with the current work that we are in the thematic papers that we are developing, trying to discuss the common subject matters, to discuss all the conceptual aspects, and also practical examples that will help us to understand how to implement those principles of the right to the city. The workbook is available, has already been published, it's online or free of charge, both in the CLACSO website and the global platform for the right to the city website as well. And this workbook intends to spread the notion of the right to the city and with some of the essential elements, talking about the challenges and the current mobilizations and talking about feminist cities, focus on gender, anti-racist cities, free of all kinds of discrimination. And the link between the rural and the urban areas, we want to expand more and depthen that aspect in this discussion. And the articles of the workbook will help us in that sense. And we wish you that you could actually read them and engage in this dialogue with us and make your contributions. So, mainly thinking in how to reactivate many of the proposals of the right to the city that we've been struggling for decades, linked with the most current demands. So, because it's like an open book that we want to build it together with you. So, basically, to be very fast about the different papers, these initiatives that we've been working since the last year with the team of the Global Platform for the Right to the City. We've been prepared. 3 of the documents have already been completed. 1 is published, and the 2 others are to be published this year. The one because of the right to the city and climate change. The second is cities as a common good or common asset. And the third one, the right to the city and COVID-19, their negative impacts and the deepening of inequalities and opportunities for transformation. And now, in this session, and this session is focused in the discussion of another 4 articles to be prepared this year. Cities free of discrimination is today's discussions, the urban-rural links that we have discussed yesterday, cities inclusive citizenship that we're going to discuss next week, and quality public spaces that we have had a session. The sessions that already happened are all already online and you can assist them. So, in order to finish the introduction, why this initiative? Why these papers? Because, as I told you, we want to deepen the conceptual aspect and talk about experiences and concrete recommendations. So we are focusing forming goals in order that will help us in advocacy from locally to international spheres in order to depthen in research and training that will help us to communicate and bring awareness on the right to the city, and mainly in the link with movements of current advocacy and activities of training and capacity building activities, and this is open so that your organizations can use all these materials and broaden the scope of all those things. That's why we record them and we put so how are we are making? We're making a collective process with many different layers of interaction. So there's a group of consultants that will help us in order to facilitate the process and prepare the the workbooks, a group of references with people from different organizations that could actually give different points of view with the experience of their own work, and activities as the ones we are doing today's open dialogue workshops to pick up different points of view, tune up our messages, and to understand experiences and other cases that you would like to show, and that could be a reference for the recommendations. So, after the series of webinars in September, October, we are going to work in the revision by the reference group, and the documents will be ready or finished, completed at the end of the year, so that we can actually launch them starting from next year. So we please continue to participate in this process. So since with no further time, we are going to hear the cases from the Lima first, and then from Quito. First, Jazmín, Goicochea, and then Ignacio. So I'm going to give the word to Manuel, that he will help us in the moderation, coordination of all these works. Thank you very much for being here, because we would love to listen your proposals and contributions. Thank you very much, Lorena. Let us kick off these great activities, this third circle, because it's an effort of different, joint effort of different organizations that is actually being very productive in these talks. For today, as we have already been told, we've got an organization. We are going to get started with the first presentation, that it is that Jazmín Espinosa, that coming from the Peruvian case from Lima, and going to talk a little bit about the different ways of production of the urban space. So she has written in the workbook that you've got the link in the chat. Let us listen to Jazmín, and then we continue with the next of people of speakers. So Jazmín, let's go for it. So hello to all sisters and brothers. Well, we are going to share my screen so that oh, hey. So, as already been told, what I'm going to tell you is part of what we showed in the workbook, talking about urban inequalities. Is a part of research, is my thesis for my bachelor degree, and I call it struggles for the city, the work and life, and talks about the women in agriculture from Lima and Pachacama, that's in Peru, nearby Lima city. So the first approach, regarding methodology, this has been based in interviews for 3 women with a survey for 217 women, all farmer women, but organized, linked to agroecology. And these women, in order for you to understand how is their process, they are women that live in Lorena and Pachacama, but they have got a journey a difficult journey in their relation with Liman and district. These are women that come from different territories of the country, of farming traditions. People from the Andean regions with different cities in the middle of the mountains. And they arrive during the second half of last century in a context where Peru stopped to being so rural and started to turn urban. Lima cities started to urbanize, and people migrate for different factors, sometimes because of the political violence we live in this country. So they arrive at the age of 20, 19-year-olds with their families. So they come looking for working conditions, sometimes to study, and some come directly to work as a maid, and the change was okay. And even sometimes they received just a bed and food in exchange for work, so they were working for free just for a mattress and food. And some others came to work in cleaning in the public sector. Uh, and those that came to study were very little that actually arrived university or technical superior education. Sometimes went to nursery and other studies. And this was not. How can I tell you? They see some difficulties in they found problems in this gathering with the city because they spoke Quechua instead of Spanish or other native languages. The gender was also a condition, the physical appearance, socio-economical situation, all that affected different factors that had to do with who they are, actually block their access to many rights as work and education, because many didn't go to education because they didn't know how to talk Spanish. Then those that were able to go and work or have superior educations in many different cases, they need to leave their work because they start to live with a couple and having children, generating other responsibility that actually makes them leave their paid work, and that implied economical conditions that were very precarious, that actually, and in the different neighborhoods, they would then go and start to organize in order for supply as grassroots people, organization for common having food, and they continue to take care, but now in a collective way, because they don't have enough livelihood to buy their needs. But these generated also a series of internal struggles in their homes, because they were making collective that of a problem that people thought it should be private. So, but these gatherings in the organization also generated that they discussed about things that were happening to all of them. They were common to all of them because of their condition of being women, to how in many cases they had insecurities of dependency and violence. So, and they start to discuss these kind of issues, and that kinds of discussions start to be clear placed on the table. And during these processes, then we go to Lorena and Pachacama. There are two different districts in Lima. And then they go there and they recover a little bit the knowledge they already had or from the territories from where they came, and the different organizational forms that they had learned in the journey of life inside Lima City. So when they went to Lima, so they started to develop their farming activities because that enabled that to have more time to take care of their children, care or taking care of their home, that also was a burden on them. And in this process, this Lurin Valley that picks both districts, uh, we start to see a process of urbanization in this territory that is growing and getting more intense and ends up reducing the farming area, imposing then more an urban space, reducing these farming territories where they were working. This generated now the disappearance of the farming activities. That's a process they are in. They have started to have problems for access to water because they use water for production. They've got wells in order to water some of the lands that have even 4 hectares, and some others are smaller orchards that they can address that water with a well. But the big ones, they've got difficulty in order for irrigation and have access to water, because the water is being used only for the urban through pipings that close the access to water through those women's. And they're in the middle of a series of they've got different kinds of pollutions in the water, in the environment they are inserted. They affected their life and also their productions, because sometimes the water they are delivered to them to water the plants is contaminated, and that is also implies a bigger effort and costs. But nonetheless, they continued in this work, trying to have some different strategies in order to address their problems that started from their urbanization problems. So the organization then their organization appears as an important factor. Based on the surveys, we see 37% of the women that go to the organization, these farming women in that valley, that go to their organizations in 3 different ways. Some is because of the agroecological production. They start to see different organizations, and I've mentioned different examples that are organizations. One is mixed organization, the others are women's organizations, where the agroecology then appears in smaller orchards, but also for the self-consumption, because the farming is also difficult to trade the products. We've got middlemen that they don't pay them what it is due for their efforts and for the expenditure that they actually have in order to actually manage their work. And so they have these agroecological activities implemented so that they can actually feed from their products. They start to diversify, and they are much more healthy products. And they also have we've got communities of watering communities that we see them in the different districts in small communities as ways, or for women as well, as ways to handle the issue of water in a more egalitarian way. And Biolurin, there's an experience that's been done in Lurin. They have advocated a lot before the municipalities, with the help with some NGOs, have participated in the management of these organizations in order to build free markets in order to sell their district, because if not, they needed to travel different districts in order to trade, because in their district they were not able to do it because the agroecological production is a little bit more expensive as well. And that, all that generated difficulties. So these open markets appear that actually happens every Sunday out of the outskirts of the municipality, and they sell their products. So another way of organization that they've got is exactly the shared places to eat, because sometimes these are places that are not formalized, places that they don't receive support from the state, that they need to manage these, and they address that. They sell there and they help that in those places. They serve food that they also cultivated. Yeah, that's very necessary. So, and another way of organization, they participate in political organization, also in political parties. They are more or less the leaders that they, due to because of their needs, they are actually advocating this organization. So this organization, because in many different cases, many political parties, the women, they do not participate in the decision making, but they participate with their husbands, and they actually help more prepare more the food, and they don't participate so much in the decision making processes, mainly in the political parties. So, but 2 minutes more only. I'm finishing. And so we've got the different kinds of organizations for them. In order to close my presentation, regarding because of the history, when they met first the city of Lima, then they go to the valley. Now they've got, you see, the whole thread that of their history, and they find in the organization a way of managing a strategy to address their problems. They build their infrastructure for caring. They work. They advocate for their problems, and all that based on the issue of the needs they have. And I think that this is a way of managing their own territory, of fighting for their territory, so that in building organized ways of developing their work, their lives in an organized, in a collective way among themselves. So that was all that I wanted to share with you, and thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jazmín, for telling us all that so important. Gladys from Paraguay said that there's a system, a similar system in Paraguay, because they've seen different processes, similar processes in Latin America. And regarding in the different process, it's important to put questions. So thank you very much for your presentations or introduction. Now let's go to Ignacio Espinosa, that comes from the International University of Ecuador, that also has a small text in the workbook that has just been published. So Ignacio, please, a great pleasure, and we're here to listen to you. So hello with all of you. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay. So what I've prepared for you today, together with a global platform and CLACSO, because we are going to talk about how to intersectionate the right to the city in Kitty, but just put you an example for you to know for different examples. We're going to talk about sexual differences and how they actually happened during these times, and how this actually strengthens and broadens the concept of the right to the city. Some of the two, we're going to talk about the right to the city or the right to appropriate and participation that sometimes we talked about from a logic from classes as these collective rights. Many times as well, that notion doesn't enable that the grassroots, the workers, makes that they cannot participate in the production of the space, and sometimes it's also limited the appropriation of the space by them. So if we understand the right to the city as an addition of all those rights, and we need to conceptualize that from a logic that, of course, includes the labor part, but also from the point of view of a multidimensional poverty, including health, education, life standard. Mm, we understand this. The right to the city is the addition of many different rights and collective rights, and that could fit better with this vision of this multidimensional poverty. That breaks this logic of classes that limits itself just to income. Of course, it exists, but it is only one of the different aspects, of the many aspects. So these collective rights affect the working class, but the working class is not homogeneous as well. So we need to question the collective rights of who, and that includes workers, unemployed, women, people from different alternative sex, children. So uh, this worker class is diverse, it's not homogeneous. So the right to this includes many different collective rights and many different identities that are intersectional. So these different collective rights affect different people. So from the logic of intersectionality, we were talking about black feminism, bell hooks. We don't talk about woman, but the women. We talk about the woman. Normally, we're talking about the Caucasian, and then we talk about the Afro descendants. We talk about men, Afro men. So, and what about the Afro women? They are invisible in that discussion. So under this logic, then we need to start to think that in order to advocate for the right to the city, we need to talk about different multiple identities and from there multiple rights because of this excluded working class, excluded from the urban appropriation. And the Lefebvre tells that the capitalist ideologist is imposed on the urbanized processes, but in order to have a free concept, we need to resist to that capitalist society and also the patriarchal city, heteronormative, cisnormative, colonialist, imperialist, capacitist, anthropocentrist, all these ideologies, all these relations, they actually reflect into the space and reproduce and grow and get stronger in the space. So we need to understand the right of the city within this class logic. Is we all understand it as liberalism, but this includes all these relational things and includes many other dynamic relations and different rights for each person. And we need to include different ideologies, Marxistas, feminists, ecologists, and imperialists. And I'm going to tell you about I'm going very fast because in order not to steal your time, but I'm going to tell you about this case of sexual dissidents mobilized during the pandemic, making awareness of these urban fictions and how these can help us to broaden this utopia for the right to the city, this utopia. So during the pandemic of COVID-19, we saw and see many inequalities growing, and we saw more barriers in order to actually have the right to the city. And many of these urban inequalities were presented by the national and local authorities as unavoidable realities. I'm going to analyze three many bullet things. We're going to about the pedestrian and its mobility. El hashtag quédate en casa, stay at home, and in health and cleaning. And so through these examples, I'm going to show you how the right to the city is actually linked to the right to mobility, water, housing, and health, to many different rights, but they affect differently different identities. So let us go to talk about the pedestrian and his right or her right to mobility. And the walk and move through the city is one of the ways of appropriate of the city. And during these quarantines, many of these limitations were placed. We are going to talk. We've got the literal signs. We said the situation of pedestrian. This man that ignore this image ignores the feminine movements, and this is how we contextualize the way of moving during the pandemic. And the pedestrian in Spanish is masculine. So sometimes people, because of patriarchal roles, they are forced to move with objects, with carrying people, with when they go to buy things to the grocery articles, and all that is not included in the image of this mobility in the pandemic as well, and that also not even prior to the pandemic. So here, we need to understand that it's not the same to move in this way during a gay movement that they've got a certain privilege of being masculine. But if you're different from a trans woman or a non-binary person, then we need to actually handle the machismo in the streets. Also, the same to work from the sexual dissidency that works alone and working with his or her partner, showing his her affect in a public space. So there was a gathering that was organized by the Transmasculine Organization, and Sebastian, one of the persons that was participating, told me how he, as being a trans boy, he started to live, understand the masculine space, for example, uh, and then he needed, for example, harassment, or Derek, he didn't pass through harassment. Then Derek told us how this, in this event that we created, organized by our brotherhood, he told us he also passed that we needed to, he know that people, when saw as a man, Afro-Ecuadorian, they just crossed to the other sidewalk. So seeing how actual mobility it needs to be seen differently, even within the called LGBT. You cannot homogenize because these groups are absolutely diverse. And they are going to have a different, they will be affected differently in the public space. So, so this image of the pedestrian doesn't actually ignores of who is moving, with who is moving, with objects, how getting a children in your arms. So that's why it was very important to analyze the case of Bogota, because it's interesting to see other cities that will help you to generate lessons. And in the case of Bogota, we applied the big plaque. Well, there was something that was applied due to the quarantine for Bogota. In Bogota was divided by gender, was pick and gender for mobility, for not instead of pick and plate number. So here you could see how basically we understood that if the pedestrians are not men, they should be women. And actually, we know that gender, it's not binary. People don't fit within these dual simplistic points of view, or and sexist view, man or woman. So, and the measure was applied in Bogota's. No? So that's a kind of violence on the bodies of these people, mainly from the that are sexually dissident from this binary categorization. So, so we need to correct some of these things. So at the end of this is a one example how my life and it was applied, although it was a fiction within the division of the gender man and woman, it was applied anyway, and how it was reproduced in the space, how the space actually reproduced this logic of divide ourselves within these binary parameters. So it's important to understand that pedestrians that have more friction and struggle in the movements, and their control, their movement is controlled with more frequency. So Ignacio, we've got 2 minutes only. Okay. So if you stay at home and unifamiliar home, as a pedestrian, like moving is a privilege, and not moving is also so. Staying at home, of course, it's another privilege that we saw in the pandemic. We see some of the measures taken, stay at home. They saw broad, beautiful houses with gardens, family, it's a more homogeneous. Uh, uh, we say the family is not homogeneous. Actually, sometimes it's unequal, it's diverse. Many people of the sexual diversity were expelled from their homes, being at home sometimes under certain parameters. They need to live within the parameters of their families. You see these three images, how the government showed how many house families in a very colonial way, mother, mommy, daddy, and two children. All these was just another fiction, a fantasy, and it was applied and last very fast, clean, you need to wash your hands. It was not realistic for some neighborhoods, and though that measure was applied. So when some of the people showed here, this is a photograph. The Fuente Solidaria is of the transgender movement. That was what did it was create neighborhood networks of healthy food, and they managed to pressure so that the city hall could deliver some food that was able thanks to the collective pressure. So yes, these different experiences showed us of the urban model, eh, what is actually how full of fantasies it is, the model that is being shown to us. We've got all these other alternatives that are being shown, that how we should commute more, and we need to approach this from different approaches, from different rights, in order to ensure the right to the city. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ignacio, for problematizing some ways of understanding how these policies were actually being implemented, of trying to control all the city, but under these homogeneous characteristics. So then we're going to have time to discussions, and I'm absolutely sure that we're going to have lots of questions. So now let's go to the third presentation. Now it's going to be a presentation, a collective presentation led by Irene, Escorihuela, Marta, Ribera, and Caicedo from the Observatori, that as they're going to produce one of the advancements and the documents they are preparing within the right to the city. So with no further delay, the word is with you. So thank you, Julieta. Can you share the presentation? Actually, yes, I can share it.
Quería preguntar también, ¿tenemos 15 o 20 minutos?
Do we
Porque
have 15 or 20 minutes? Because it's 15 or 20 minutes, she's asking.
Les vamos a dejar 20 minutos, pero bueno.
You may be 20, yes, but it depends on how we advance in order to earn, to gain more time for the discussion at the end. So let's go. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity of being here. It's a great pleasure to be here to share with all of you the work that we're doing. And as told, this is a draft. It's many things to add. And for us, it's very useful to share. It's a pleasure to share with all of you our work and listen to your contributions, examples and practical things that you may be thinking and we didn't incorporate, and we want to have theoretical discussions. It's okay, it's fantastic. We are so happy to be here with you. The other presentations have given us already some examples of practices and sometimes good practices and bad practices that we could actually add some bits of that and to share that. I'm Irene, Escorihuela. Marta and Natalia are the ones that participated in my presentation. Next slide, please. So for us, we put it in English because we thought we needed to talk in English, but if we can talk in Spanish, even better, because we are from Barcelona. And it's our mother tongue together with Catalan. So I wanted to tell you that the cities and human settlements free of discrimination is very important for the right to the city and also for the people that work in human rights in a broader concept. In the paper, we've got a theoretical aspect, but we also incorporate examples of practices that is actually would be more useful. We are going to put our biggest part of our focus. We're going to explain the theoretical part, but we're going to mainly put cases and recommendation for the civil society and the local government. And we think that here maybe you can actually give us some hints of what recommendations what to add. So here in the contents, we've got the introduction, and then we are going to talk about the international right of human rights regarding non-discrimination and legal cases on commissions of the United Nations. So in point number 3, we're going to talk about the discrimination towards whom that our colleague Ignacio was explaining. The different formats that this discrimination could actually, although there are many different cases, but we are going to center in 3. I'm going to explain all that to you, and then different spheres or ways or how discrimination turns visible. In institutional discrimination, space or spatial unfairness, intersectoriality, that's very important, is being included in these discussions, and structural or systematic discrimination. Finally, we're going to talk about experiences of local government and civil society and recommendations. I wanted to make that little introduction, then give the word to my colleague Marta. Julieta, please. Hello, good evening, good morning. I'm Marta. I'm going to introduce the 2 next bullet points, and we start talking in our papers of what is the focus, what approach we put the international as you said, the right of the non-discrimination for its citizens. And we found 3 different approaches. The first one in which the cities are responsible because the treaties have been assigned by the member states. And the second one, it is mentioned the local government as responsible of actually implementing the non-discrimination. And these 2 main focus that actually encompass most of the cases of the commissions of the United Nations. And we actually more interested in the third one. From these 2 first ones, there are some cases that we found that we thought it very interesting regard because they include the vision of the intersectionality as the case of Denmark. And then also regarding the second approach, we saw that they assume that they are responsible not to discriminate based on race, for example. And last, we found a case in which although the local governments are autonomous in their way of implementing the national government, they had the responsibility of acting based on these international principles of the non-discrimination. But the most important is the third approach, that we put the city in the center of responsibility. So it's the city that actually assumes a commitment and has the responsibility of non-discriminating in a certain sense, and that focus is content here. You've got some of the international documents that includes like the War Charter for the Right to the City and others, and they have had very little amounts of cases under this approach, we're incorporating these more international documents as an international agenda of the United Nations. There are many different goals that talk about the right to the city, like that make cities and settlements more inclusive. And this view is gaining protagonisms, and what we were writing in the paper, is that the documents that are under this approach are very relevant for local governments and civil society, because the cities are the ones that actually assume the commitments, but they kind of incorporate in order to interpret, to develop the laws that are already doing regarding non-discrimination. And also, for us as civil society, it's very important so that we can review and understand that the cities are actually compliant with their commitments. Next one, please. So the next part we're talking about is who is discriminated in the city, and we talk about the different axes of inequality or pillars of the inequality and discrimination that are very big. One of the things that we got surprised is that we saw that very little passed away. We've been including new non-discrimination pillars regarding the case that was presented by Jazmín in the metropolitan city of Lima. We found that in the ordinance of the metropolitan area of Lima, we had the no discrimination based on language, as Jazmín said, that they had people that were discriminated because they didn't talk Spanish. And we also saw the inclusion of novelty pillars, that discrimination by age or poverty and others we found in the law anti-discrimination from Catalonia. But in the paper, when we analyze the cases and situation of discrimination, we based in the most traditional pillars, because are the ones that are handled more frequently with more intensity by the city when they develop norms against discrimination that are gender, race, and sexual orientation or sexual identity. And so I've placed a couple of examples that we wanted to share how women in city have less access to property, to home, to cars. They can have different patterns of movements, and they're exposed to sexual harassment. And also, for example, the women have special places for women in the metro or the subway, because they will use it in a more safer way. And regarding the ethnicity, the separation that is made in many different cities implies that sometimes people that are excluded, they don't go so much to the services that are concentrated in certain areas of the city. And there are many different initiatives that we found. We found the itinerant justice, where the Ministry of Justice makes convoys that go to the outskirts, to the favelas, to offer orientation and justice in these communities, so that they can actually have access to the cities. Regarding what Ignacio mentioned, although we talk about discriminations in the pillars of those pillars, it doesn't mean that we don't take into account Ignacio has explained the intersectionality, how people could be bearing different aspects of this inequality, and we need to understand the collective dimension of the right to the city. See how the city is actually a whole set of rights that encompasses many different diversities, and that is commented in our paper. And now I'm going to give the word to Natalia.
Bueno, como decía Marta, yo soy también una de las personas que ha colaborado,
Marta,
¿no?, en
one
la
of the people
elaboración
that has
del
helped in
paper.
the preparation of the
Otra de
paper.
las, ¿no?, partes que hemos
Another of the
trabajado
parts that we've
y
been
que nos
working
interesaba
and
desarrollar era
we wanted
analizar o
to
ver cómo actúa la
talk and develop is
discriminación.
understand how
Y nosotros
discrimination
pensamos que
acts, and
efectivamente era
we
importante
thought that
introducir
it
este
was very
apartado
important to
porque es
introduce
verdad
this chapter
que
because or this paragraph
sí, ¿no?, una
because
ciudad quiere
yes, if a
iniciar
city
una
wants
acción o
to
una normativa,
start a
una política
norm or
pública para
action or a
luchar contra la
public policy
discriminación, ¿no?, que
to
existe en su ciudad,
fight
creemos que
discrimination
lo
in the
primero que
city, we
debe
think
hacer
that the
es
first thing
saber
that
o
needs to
entender
do
cómo
is
actúa o cómo
understand
se desarrolla o qué
how is
amplitud
developed or
tiene,
what's
¿no?, la
the
discriminación a la
scope
cual ella
of
quiere
or
hacer
the
frente.
reach of the
Y
discrimination she
aquí,
wants to
digamos
face,
que
he or
teníamos
she or
dos
the city
opciones,
wants to face.
optar por
And
un
so
enfoque, digamos,
we need to
individual de la
opt by an
discriminación directa e
individual
indirecta o un
approach
enfoque
there,
más
or
colectivo.
a
Y, ¿no?,
collective
al final
approach.
decidimos,
And
¿no?,
at the end, we decided
abordar, ¿no?, los enfoques de cómo
approach
actúa la discriminación desde una
the
perspectiva
discrimination
colectiva.
from
Y
a
aquí,
collective
bueno, nosotros
perspective.
tenemos primero, ¿no?,
So
la idea
here
de
we
la
have
discriminación
the idea
institucional,
of
que es
institutional
aquella
discrimination
discriminación
that is
producida desde
the
las autoridades
discrimination produced
públicas o,
by
como hemos visto, ¿no?, de
from
los
the
casos
public
desde
authorities,
las ciudades o
as we
las
saw, for example,
municipalidades,
from the
ayuntamientos, etcétera.
municipalities, so forth.
¿Cómo se
City
promueve? Bueno,
halls.
pues se promueve por
So
normas,
it's
¿no? Por ejemplo, la
promoted through
denegación de derechos o de
norms, the
servicios públicos
denial of
a
services of
minorías,
public
migrantes o
services to
colectivos LGTBI, ¿no?,
migrants,
personas o colectivos que
LGBTQA+,
pueden ser discriminados
collectives
y
that can
a
be
través, ¿no?, de la
discriminated
denegación de
through
servicios
the
públicos
denial
o
of
incluso de
public
denegación
services
de
or
derechos,
either
la
or
implementación
denial
de
of
políticas
rights.
públicas,
So the implementation of
también,
public
¿no?, de
policies
manera, digamos, un poco menos visible, estas declaraciones
to
públicas que hacen,
have
¿no?, las
public
autoridades,
declarations
¿no?,
that
en
the
determinados
authorities do
discursos,
in
también
certain
pueden, ¿no?, haber
speeches
actos
could
de
also
discriminación. A
see
nuestro compañero, ¿no?,
discriminations
como lo
to
habéis
our
visto y también lo
colleague, as
señalaba
he
Marta, nos
saw
ha
and said by
ejemplificado, por
Marta. He
ejemplo,
has
¿no?, cómo las
example that
campañas promovidas
has
desde las autoridades locales
campaigns
también pueden ser
promoted by local
discriminatorias, en este
authorities
caso, ¿no?,
are
para el colectivo
discriminatory
LGTBI
for
no
the
binario,
LGBTQ and
o incluso,
non-binary
¿no?, actos
collectives
simbólicos que,
and
¿no?,
symbolic as
aparentemente son
that
neutrales,
apparently
tienen
they're
un gran
neutral,
contenido
they have a
discriminatorio,
very
como,
big
¿no?, después
discrimination content
lo desarrollará un
as
poco Irene.
is going to be
Aquí
told by Irene
nosotras hicimos,
in a
¿no?,
little
un
while.
cierto
So what did
énfasis
we
a la
do?
idea que
We
este tipo
wanted to talk
de
about the
discriminación tiene un
issue
impacto
that
mucho más
this
profundo en la medida en que viene
discrimination
dado o
has
determinado
a
por
stronger
la propia
impact
capacidad de acción y el
because
poder de la
it's
institución, ¿no? No
actually
es lo mismo que ser
comes from the hand of
discriminada
the power of the
en un acto
institution. It's not the
individual
same thing
al
being
alquilar un piso,
discriminated
por ejemplo,
when by an
¿no?, que lo
individual
haga el
than being
ayuntamiento en su política de
discriminated by the
alquiler,
city
porque el
hall in
impacto será
their
mucho
policy,
mayor
because
que
impact is
si
far
hablamos, digamos, de
bigger
la
than we're
discriminación
talking
ejercida
about from the
desde particulares,
discrimination from
podríamos
a
decir.
private person, natural person.
La discriminación
So the
espacial, este es
discrimination,
otro de
the
los
spatial
tipos, ¿no?,
discrimination, this
de
is another kind of
discriminación que
discrimination
evaluamos
that we
o que
assess,
estudiamos o que
that we
incluimos,
started, we
y la
include,
idea es que
and
es
the
una
idea is
discriminación
that this
vinculada
is
desde
as
una
a
perspectiva
discrimination linked
geográfica.
to a
En
geographical
primer
perspective.
lugar,
First
y
of
no lo
all,
vimos, por ejemplo, en la
we
ponencia
saw
que
that
nos
in the
dijo Jazmín,
speech
claro,
by
la
Jazmín,
discriminación
the
puede impactar de
discrimination could
manera
actually
distinta dependiendo
impact
del lugar
differently
de donde se
depending
proviene, no es
on
lo mismo,
where
¿no?
you
Las
come. It's not
discriminaciones
the
que está
same the
sujeta una mujer
discrimination that a
que viene
woman
del ámbito
is
rural
subject to,
a
that
una mujer que
comes
ya
from the
vive en las
countryside,
ciudades, ¿no?
that
Son
for
dos
a woman that's from
ámbitos o
already
dos
born in that
formas,
city.
¿no?, de actuar de la
There are two
discriminación
different
totalmente
ways of
distintas.
discrimination,
Pero
absolutely
también, ¿no?,
different.
cuando hablamos de
But also
discriminación
when we
en
talk about
tema territorial,
discrimination
nos
regarding
referimos
territories,
a la
we
posibilidad de
talk about the
acceso a los
possibility of
recursos o a las
access to the
oportunidades que
resources and
están distribuidas
opportunities
de manera
that are
inequitativa en las
distributed
ciudades.
in
La
an
discriminación
unequal way in the
espacial
whole
también,
city.
¿no?, la podemos
The
vincular con los
spatial
procesos de
discrimination
gentrificación,
linked
¿no?, donde
to
los
the
colectivos o
gentrification
las
processes where
poblaciones, ¿no?,
the
más
different
pobres o en
collectives or
situación de vulnerabilidad
poorer or
son
the grassroots of the
expulsadas de los
country
centros
is
hacia las
expelled
periferias,
from
¿no?,
the
estos
centers
procesos
of the
que tienen
cities
ahora las
from
ciudades de
these
caminar hacia modelos
processes
muy
that
neoliberales. Claro,
have
en
the
este
city in these
sentido, ¿no?,
neoliberal
podríamos
processes.
pensar o
So
decir,
we
¿no?, que
need
uno de los
to
deberes, o casi que
understand that
si
one of
hacemos, ¿no?,
the
los deberes que deben
homeworks
hacer
that
los ayuntamientos o las
the city
ciudades,
halls
las
need to
municipalidades,
do, the
es revisar
municipalities,
sus
is
políticas
to
urbanas, sus
review the
políticas de
urban
planificación,
policy or their
evaluar, ¿no?, en qué
planning
medida los
policies
servicios
and
públicos
assess
disponibles
if the
tienen un
public
efecto
services
territorial de
have
discriminación.
a territorial
muchas de las
discrimination, in effect.
discriminaciones actuales, ¿no?, que
Many of the
tenemos
current discriminations that we've got
deberían, ¿no?, dar lugar
depend
a la evaluación
or
de
should
estas políticas.
give a space for
Y
reassessment of the
también
policies
hablábamos, ¿no?,
actually
en el
implemented,
paper se
currently
refiere
implemented.
a
And
la
the paper
discriminación
talks also
estructural,
about
y
the
aquí son
structural
prácticas
discrimination,
generalizadas y ampliamente
and these
extendidas de
generalized
discriminación.
practices of
Esto supone que la
discrimination.
discriminación
This
afecta a
supposes
todas
that
las
the
áreas
discrimination
de
affects
vida de
all
los
the
grupos, de los
areas
colectivos o de las
of the
personas.
groups or
Discriminación social,
people,
política, económica,
social,
institucional. Y
political,
por lo tanto,
economic,
si un
institutional
ayuntamiento,
discrimination.
una
So,
ciudad o una
if a
municipalidad
city
quiere,
whole
¿no?, abordar la
municipality
discriminación
want
desde una
to
perspectiva
talk about
estructural,
discrimination
deberá
from a structural
entender
perspective,
que debe abarcar
it
todas estas
needs
áreas.
to
Si
understand that
nosotros
needs
pensamos,
to
por ejemplo,
encompass
en un
all these
ejemplo, ¿no?,
aspects.
que
If
nos
we're going
puede
to think about an
situar en la
example
discriminación
that actually
estructural,
located
es la
in the
segregación
structural
escolar, porque en la
discrimination is
segregación escolar influyen, ¿no?, las
the
políticas y
school
regulaciones desde las instituciones,
segregations
¿no?, las
that it comes.
municipalidades
So the
quienes estructuran, ¿no?,
municipalities
los
are the ones that
servicios
structure the
de
services
educación
of
pública.
public
También
education.
hay segregación escolar
We've got
espacial,
also
porque está muy vinculada,
spatial
¿no?, las escuelas
segregation
segregadas a determinados
because
barrios, sobre todo barrios más
the segregated
empobrecidos
schools
o
are in the
etnificados,
more
etcétera.
poorer
También,
neighborhoods.
¿no?, a discriminación
So
económica,
there's the
porque
economical
no,
discrimination
la segregación
because
escolar sucede, ¿no?, sobre todo sobre
then
familias en situación de
this
vulnerabilidad, familias
discrimination
con
of
pocos recursos,
school
familias
actually
migrantes,
affect
¿no?
people
Y
with low
también, ¿no?,
income,
hay, ¿no?, un
migrants, for
conjunto,
example,
la discriminación,
and
podríamos decir, social, ¿no?,
they've
toda
got
esta
also
idea
the
de
social
estereotipos sociales
discrimination,
extendidos
this
sobre
idea
los
of
menores que
extended
van a
stereotypes
este tipo
of
de escuelas, ¿no?
the
Las familias diciendo, no, no
boys
vayas
and
a esa
girls that
escuela
go
porque
to the
allí hay
school.
migrantes, no vayas a esa escuela
Or
porque allí van
people say,
los
don't go
hijos
to
de las
the school
personas
because
indígenas
got
o
the children of the
etcétera.
indigenous
Entonces,
people of the migrants don't
es
go to that
¿no?,
school.
una discriminación
So it's a
que
discrimination
afecta,
that
además, potencialmente
affects
afecta a aquellos colectivos que han estado
those
históricamente
collectives or
discriminados,
groups
¿no?
that have been
Si yo soy una persona
historically
que
discriminated.
en
If I'm a
alguna de las
person
condiciones
that in
de mi
one of the
grupo, tengo más
conditions of my
probabilidades de que
group
esta
that are
discriminación estructural
discrimination,
me
it's
afecte
more
que
probable
si
that
no formo
my
parte de estos
this
grupos. Y
structural
finalmente,
discrimination
la
will affect
discriminación
me. And
interseccional, es
finally,
verdad
the
que
intersectional discrimination,
tratar, ¿no?, la discriminación
that
interseccional en muy poco
intersectional
espacio no fue fácil.
discrimination was not
Básicamente, ¿no?,
easy
bueno, entramos a describir
to talk
qué
about.
es, ¿no?,
We
o cómo se
explain
define la
what it
discriminación
is, how to
interseccional,
define it,
los
the
orígenes,
intersectional
¿no? También
discrimination, the
lo ha señalado
origins,
Ignacio en
as
su
told
documento, los
by
orígenes del
Ignacio,
feminismo negro, y
about, for example, when he talks about
cómo
the black feminism, and
la discriminación
the
interseccional hace
discriminations
que las
makes that
personas o los grupos que
people or the
sufren esta
groups that
discriminación lo
suffer
hagan de
this
manera
discrimination
más agravada o
is
de manera
even worse.
específica. También entendemos que
So
es
we
relevante, ¿no?,
understand that it's
entender que
also
los
relevant to
ayuntamientos
understand
o
that
las
the
ciudades
city
tengan en
halls or
cuenta
municipalities,
en la formulación y aplicación de las
when
políticas
they
públicas de
apply
interseccionalidad,
public
porque el riesgo es
policies
que
to apply the
políticas,
intersectionality,
¿no?,
because the risk
aparentemente
that policies that
podríamos decir
apparently
inclusivas, si
could
no
be
tienen en
inclusive,
cuenta, ¿no?, la
if they don't
interseccionalidad,
take into consideration the
acabarán
whole
siendo discriminatorias
intersectionality, will
contra
be discriminating
hacia aquellos
against those
colectivos que poseen
groups or
dos o
collectives
más
that
ejes
have two or
de
more,
discriminación, a donde
3
converge
points
la
of
discriminación indirecta, de ahí
discrimination.
la importancia.
That's why they're
Yo con
important.
esta parte aquí
With that
acabaría
part, I
y si
finished my
quieres,
part,
Irene,
and
continúas.
Irene, if you want to continue a little bit further. So very fast, I'm going to check my time. In examples and good practices, we talked about international networks that work in non-discrimination subject matters. And the question is, if one of you that you know this, if you know whether these are good practices, because here we want to share experiences and examples. Some cases we saw that we see published guidelines on how to create anti-discrimination workshops, but we saw received some critics. Some of you have feedbacks on all these materials, it would be very interesting. But I wanted to mention that many different international and regional networks that work with best practices regarding this subject matter. And so then we include some examples of experiences that we found very interesting, and you can contribute with us in that. And we've chosen four subjects first. Well, the specific creation of workshops against discrimination of observatories that could have a broad spectrum of services can be a space where you can actually put your claim, or spaces where we do community mediation, we do training, where we publish reports. In Barcelona, we work in network with many different organizations of civil society. Here we've got the report of last year, where we see what are the breaches against discriminations, where, by whom, so forth. But we see these kind of workshops in many different cities, and depending on the budget, if they depend on the municipality budgets, they've got a bigger or smaller reach. But I think it's an interesting practice to be replicated. Then we've got the training strategy, mainly for employees and public employees, mainly to policemen on or public security systems, because where we see the biggest part of discriminations and ethnic profiling, to stop people and analyze documentation, people that are different race, different strategies that of course happen in all the spheres of the administration, but most with the policemen. Mainly this strategy happens from the workshops that I told you, because they've got curriculum, they've got different ways of doing. Sometimes they're done from organizations that support the administrations on those subject matters. So we put the example of London's of one of the programs. Then they've got cities that talk about ordinances as legal instruments, tools that actually penalize discriminatory actions in the public space, but also the acts of the private people. In the case of Lima, it talks about open spaces as bars, grocery stores, shops, and in Jackson they had this kind of ordinance. There are other cities that don't make it so explicit, but it's very important to specify, because it's one of the bringing awareness from the local authorities to understand that this program does exist, and from the tools by the authorities through their ordinances try to approach the problem and bringing awareness. And finally, more symbolic, but also I think it's very important because culturally it's very important. The make memorial, put names to the streets, and people that have advocated for the LGBTQIA plus, or people that here in Barcelona we've got a place where a trans woman was murdered, and it was placed her name that symbolizing people that have lost their life for being from minority groups. And here we put examples of New York Stonewall. It's quite mainstream, but it's like the homage to the struggle by the LGBT and ethnicity. And we put the question on civil society, because the most part of the examples that we gather, they are actually. But the case I told you about in Barcelona, that was claimed by the civil society this moment. So this finished in a struggle for a political society. Do you know cases that the civil society has created murals or painted walls or made some kind of monument or good practices that you know? And to finish, some recommendations that we place into the paper that we don't need to go through all of them because I think most of them are things that we have already talked about. Sophia said that we could just let them there in the presentation while we discuss and we then comment it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Irene, Marta, and Natalia. In the chat, I think it was Diego Marin was where can we find the draft paper? Many have the same question. Lorena has offered to share that document and that opens and are very big. Everybody will send their actually emails and comments. I think it's been very interesting, the three presentations. I think we can now go more to a conversation moment of exchange of ideas, or to invite all of you that you can actually put your questions within the chat, and there are some specific questions. Two questions from Joel that talks about first one to Ignacio. He asks about if he's got the consent, informed consent to the use of the images. Another question is from Joel that he says to Marta. And sorry to the guy that we talk very fast. Yes, Irene talks very fast. Yes. Joel says, is possible a city without discrimination if it's fundamentally linked to the national frameworks, and whether and to Marta also, do you think that a city without discrimination is a utopia, or it was like running after your shadow? Thank you for Joel for that question. You bring a little bit of reality to our discussions, yes. Someone actually, Nelson. So thank you. And my camera is closed. But it's okay. So I am working in the global platform for the right to the city, mainly regarding these thematic papers, and I think that all the contents introduced today from the DESC observatories are very good. Mainly I think maybe that for the perspective of the rate of the city, we could actually try to clarify this component, cities in discrimination, mainly with these three elements that were introduced. I think very important, the issue on discrimination on the space in the territory. I think that's a very big question in order to actually to make connections between the right to the city and collective discrimination. That was actually the option of this document. So I think that this is the way forward, because we have already known the thing about the right to the city, the protection against discrimination. That's already in the Treaty of the Human Rights. That's okay. The struggle here is to make this to to implement that right. But when we talk about the perspective of citizen discrimination, I think that we've got this new component in the paper, that's the territorial aspect. I think this is what we need to depthen more to establish better the connection with the right to the city, because if not, we are going to talk a lot about it, and people will say we do not have needed the right to the city because we already have the non-discrimination. So that is enough for all the action for combating the discrimination. But we want to be a little bit broader than that, go beyond of the consolidated aspects. So I think that could be a possibility to explore more that component, the spatial component. And we introduce the issue of education and schools and the different territories that are more discriminated in different ways because of the infrastructure of the school, the qualification of the teaching methods, the priorities. So we need to bring educations in the most outskirts of the city. That could be one. That could be situations within this field of discrimination in the territory, in the city, make a clear connection in order for the paper to have this contribution of clarification in these connections. And regarding the maybe there's a recommendation that we talked about, the planning, the master plan, to have rules and ordinances that could contribute against discrimination. This is something else that we could explore a little bit more in the recommendation regarding the political actions that should be taken in order to face the discrimination situations inside the territories. Focus a little bit more in the risk recommendations. Thank you. So thank you, Nelson. I see that both Marta and Irene want to participate, so let us gather a couple of questions and then we make a round of discussion. And thank you, Nelson. I'm going to gather two different questions. One is from Luis Fernando. It's a question for the three presentations that he said, thank you very much for the presentation. My question is, could you actually talk about your investigation practice, how you intersect the ethnical situation in the young women's or in citizens that are with other contextual dimensions, social discussions in the struggle for the right to the city? It's a very complex question, Luis Fernando, but you've placed a challenge for three presentations. I would love to add one little question from my side to the three presentations, and then we make a round, and then back again, Jazmín, Ignacio, and Marta, and Irene give us answers to all these comments we've been receiving here. So every code very specific. The right to the city is understood from different points of view. It's actually a polysemic understanding. It's a result of the struggle of different social actors. But today, to see it is in the mouth of the standards of the states and local governments, international organisms. And we need to understand how the state, through its action, revisions of all public policies, so forth, intervening on the territory. And in that sense, in the case of Jazmín, it's very clear the process that she tells us about the question is, could you tell us a little bit more on how the state participates in these forms of social production of the urban spaces that have the women and the practices in the challenges and structural problems in the core? And how is the presence of the state? For Ignacio, very interesting, your presentation. And my question would be, currently, the comparative literature says that Ecuador has a proposal, an advanced modern proposal regarding the right to the city because of some processes of the past, unlike Brazil, Mexico had. And my question is how that is linked with what you told us. At the end of the day, that incorporation of the right to the city that you had in the proposal of the national Ecuadorian government, does it translate into reality by your presentations? Because of what, based on what you've showed us. And in the case of Marta and Irene, a question, the right to the city could be human rights, could be also other things. So, but when we talk about discrimination as an important part of the right of the city understood it as a way of participating of the decision of the public and the right to the city, and a way of, without participation, receiving in appropriate way the public assets or goods. I don't know whether if in this discussion on discrimination, maybe how to incorporate it is, could you depth in a little bit more how incorporate a discussion on the participation and distribution and how discrimination plays as a limiting aspect, an element that you also talked about, institutional aspect, legal, normative, that affects these different dimensions. Just in order to incentivize a little bit my conversation, if we go in the same order. So I'm going to ask you, please, trying to be brief because we've got a little time. Jazmín, first. Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you very much to all for your questions. And starting by the question regarding participation of the state, happens something very specific in Peru is that the answers after the advocacy done or claims done by the population. And that happens in the valley with these farming women or farmer women, but to generate processes, to use agroecology and to do free markets. They put pressure onto the municipality of Lorena in order to actually issue the possibility of implementing the free market on a weekly basis, to require that that could not be taken out from the territory where they are working. They will change the zone changes. Normally is the tool that they use in order to depthen the urbanization in those territories. That is they also put their clones, they mobilize, they generate different kinds of activities and strategy to bring awareness on their problems. And they go to the political parties, to the different organizations and groups. So that the relation with the state is always the relation of the relation with the state is that they answer if they see some struggle, and how is this problematic. And in Lima, we were able to make it visible, but still those urbanizing processes actually affect the work that they develop, mainly farming. The problematic continues. It didn't change too much, but at least still the answer with helping them with the agroecological productions. They are helped also by NGOs. It's on that on one side, and regarding on how they link all these different conditions that affect the women, I think that I tried to express it in telling a little bit about these trajectories, who they are. They are women that come from Peruvian Andes, there are women that we didn't know Spanish and needed to learn it in a mandatory way in Lima. There are women that arrived very young without formal education, or totally done in some cases without even having gone to school at all. So all these characteristics, the economical situation, all this mixed up in order to generate these precarity situations, and that has been continued until today in their working. There are women between 35 and 65-year-old. And age also mixed with all the rest, and impacted by these conditions of territory, by the different conditions of the work. The work in the farming is very precarious, and the different ways of discrimination. As Marta and Irene said, that actually all these problems have their intersection affecting their work, their life, and they also actually match. They are or actually are influenced by situations of violence. They have the problems of gender, the tasks and responsibilities, the lack of economic autonomy to address that past of economic autonomy. That, and a little bit a question for my colleagues that showed us talk today. I was in doubt on how these ways of discrimination have actually broadened within the pandemic, because it's not the same in the case of these women, the farmer women. They were affected because they need to stop the organizational activities, and mainly last year for a certain time, and only now they started back again to gather again, more talking about agroecology, but also by other organizations stopped because they were in a context of total precarity. There was no work, they couldn't trade their products, they couldn't, the open markets were not allowed to go. So many things that affected. How can we think that within this context? Because that's a structural discrimination. Actually, this is very important to think it from that point of view within this context of pandemic. That's my question and comment. Thank you, Jazmín. Ignacio. Okay, regarding the question of the right of the city in question of course, yes, we are very advanced in the national conception, the concept of the right of the city in Article 30 and 31. We mention principles and sometimes explicitly, like the right to housing, to appropriation of housing, of the habitat and producing. But when you go into practice, there's been some critics regarding the national plans. So we have had some discussion we've measured the indicators regarding to the deficit of housing, and then the second one we added the issue on basic services that today they're very important subject matters that we have had some advancements, but mainly the second regarding basic services, including the second plan, but they are not enough. They don't encompass the right to the city as a whole. And we had, there have been investments in specific places regarding transportation, but these were never measured and never were placed the goals in order to measure this right to the cities. They just measure the indicators, the cost, or the subject matter of housing and civic basis, because we've seen an improvement regarding some other issues, green areas, transportation, so forth. But of course, the part of the democratic part, the right to the city, we didn't include some kind of indicators or measurements for the next 4 years. In the first 4 years, in the further years was even worse because everything was limited to housing, not basic services, and housing is even worse, the role of the private sector under a logic that actually doesn't provide the right, only a house with a garage and a fence. So, and now we don't know, it's an enigma, because we're not even talking about housing anymore. So I think that connecting with the question of the state that has a relation of because of what we are mentioning, it's very important to understand the issue of scale. The importance of the state and the relation with the state to make effective the right to the city. And we saw also in other subject matters how families that don't have links between the family acknowledged by the state. So with some people, if you are not qualified as a family, you would qualify for some helps or grants. So in Pichincha City Hall, where Quito is, they actually under pressure by the different groups starting to give those grants and helps, questioning or what the state has defined of what is a family. And the state now actually acting under the pressure of the International Monetary Fund actually is translated and affects the right to the city as the right to water. People talked about washing the water, and they were making an agreement with the International Monetary Fund where they actually were cutting the investment in water. So we had all this. There was another fiction that actually relates to these logics of different scales affecting. May also drugs regarding HIV. They actually have cut in health. They fight physicians of all. So we need to interconnect everything, the collectives, the groups, and even from the groups to the local government and the national governments and international entities like the International Monetary Fund. We need to then to discuss the imperialism and the right to the city, because we know that when you create the new urban agenda that the global platform is working on, little by little, the United States started to pressure until we take out the right of the city, trying to take out the right to the city. In a paragraph, I think it's the 11th paragraph, uh, it's mentioned explicitly under the same token as Russia and Saudi Arabia pressures that in order to take LGBT from the new urban agenda. So they will take some countries took out the issue of the right to the city because of the liberalism, because of the global real estate companies, but others pressed against the LGBT, and that actually take us to this logic, to this dual logic of who is with who. But if we see that translated to reality, what happens when the International Monetary Fund makes cuts into Ecuador, so they stop their investments in water, drugs for HIV, they're not that affect in the different ways the different kinds of populations, the diversity of populations. So, is this false discourse that we need to understand, and we need to see all these dynamics that translate into the local, like in Bolivia. So with they took out the actually, but then they make a coup with impose a model of the FMI that doesn't enable the right to the city to the sexual dissidencies. So we need to see all the geopolitical issue and how that translates in order to assure or limit the right to the city. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the answers. So let's go now to our colleagues, Irene and Marta, that they also had something to ask so that we could actually take home and continue thinking. So we'll listen to you. Thank you, Manuela. Actually, it's a lot. We had placed 2 questions beside asking about the best questions best practice that you can actually have, because we wanted to listen everything. I'm going to put it on through the chat here. So these are the questions. Maybe regarding to the question to Joel, so utopia, it's a philosophical concept, or as a concept of utopia changes, you will never arrive to what we want to arrive. So what we've chosen the focus of from the state first, because the paper needs to limit, but we understand the cities are the ones that have more capacity of acting in the communities that live within the city and actually have access to the information. So that's why we've chosen cities. Or, as Ignacio explained, of course, the cities are part of the whole country. How can we do what can we do as civil society in order to have them accountable? Because these are the issues we've got monitors, I think, where we need to put more pressure in order to have the right to the city and the city without discrimination. But I think it's very important to have that issue because, as Irene said, why the right of the city needs to be special for the cities, so the local governments. Regarding the issue of Manuel on how to participate or not participate, I think it's very interesting. We talked about it in the recommendations. At the end of the day, if having a more inclusive city, it means to give a voice to those that have been voiceless, understanding their needs, their difficulties. But it's also that this part of making a more inclusive city without the participation, we had not yet integrated. But I think on the one side, actually, that could be addressed or of gathering all the information in the report that Irene mentioned at the end. If we gather all the information and people could report to the cities what are the kinds of discriminations they suffer, could be a way of make them participate. And the last one, of the question of Jazmín regarding the COVID, it's very complex because like COVID actually changed their life. And I think that many participation spaces that were physical, presential, now they're digital spaces. And it's got the good part and the bad thing. Obviously, the good thing is that they reach the fact people that couldn't participate now could participate through the internet, even not being physically on the place. But now we've got to have the struggle in order to give the voice to the people in the planning of the city is all translated to the digital space. And the digital space, there are many battles to be in place, and we've got the issue of access to internet. So that I think that how our inequalities has been done with the participation, we need to take into account what is the digital space and the access to internet. So that was my part, and now to give the word to Irene. Yes, I think you have answered lots of things. I was asking the question in order to share the same questions because it's very important to understand, because at the end of the day, as it's not to actually exercise right individually, no, and not suffering discrimination, but it's a collective right. So we were asking how to actually put that into more concrete recommendations. And we were making the question because we don't have the answer. We need to think a little bit more to write to that. So what you have committed, I think we're answering more or less everything. Marta was saying, actually to hold them accountable. So how to co-create a city without discrimination with a local government and the civil society, how they make a joint efforts. I was talking about Barcelona with a anti-discrimination workshop works with that. Some work in issue of the handicapped people, racism, that actually pick their own complaints of people that suffer racism, for example, and then they go that to create that report in a jointly manner. Participation of the civil society, the organized civil society with municipality organisms. But I think that the issue of discrimination, when we need to think the city, is key. And here we've got all the issue of planning, the participation or the participative planning in order to be able to participate in the political. It's very important to. The pandemic has actually destroyed many organizations that have been working, but has generated that made enable people and actually that has helped to know to receive more the different kind and don't be that afraid because my neighbor is black or drop down prejudice. And that's a thought that we were having. Our organizations that we worked and other organizations, they are very rationalists. We participate lots of people that were not born in Barcelona, and we see people there from different origins. That helps to see the other person and break the discrimination, and even to and give less space for these fascist organizations in order to divide us more. So these collective organizations that were born because of the pandemic can continue enables to know people from your neighborhood and avoiding situations of discrimination. We had that capacity regardless of the COVID situation. So thank you very much, Marta, Irene. We need to close. I'm going to give the word to a couple of words that has in order to see the reaction. Please, you need to be very, 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 very right. Just give us the idea because we are run out of time. So, Annelise, could you make a very fast comment, please? Can you hear me? Yes, absolutely. Well, I think very interesting all the different questions that you placed to us for the discussion, our colleagues. And I wanted to tell you that regarding the first question, I think that we need to see the right to the city as a space empty of actions or only for the local. In an experience that we had in order to creating the right to the city of women from Passé, it was difficult to understand some of the actions of the city hall, but we saw some initiatives that we need to actually leverage, and that helps us because the dialogue with the local government is different. It's not to tell you are doing nothing. We need to tell we are doing interesting things, but we need to improve. We need to add this and that and so forth. So we need to approach with a strategy, not to tell them they've got a total vague space or empty space, because the right to the city is a collective, but there are actions of the local government that we need to value them just for a strategy. So regarding to how to design policies of positive discrimination, the last 10 years we've been working with a group of women that dedicate to building civil construction. What's the lesson learned? Is that the economical empowerment comes first, then the political empowerment. But both are two pillars, two fundamental, essential elements that cannot be separated one from the other. And we need to create organizations that avoid the political competition. Of course, they can have political positioning, that is obvious, but avoid to not to be used by the politicians so that they can be independent from the point of view of the fulfillment of their rights, and not to accept people selling things to in order to that so that they cannot afterwards they cannot actually demand their rights. What we need is public policies that turn reality, the transformation of people, and that can be done through organization. After a lot of time, we've understood that organizing and leveraging the capacities of autonomy and our self-management, these women are able to position themselves and be spokeswomen for the claim of the rights that we've done with this organization of civil construction women's, and we are we are not supporting now the demand, and they have developed in them their capacities to continue. And regardless of the pandemic, of the political crisis that we are going through in Bolivia, is a reference of the working women in informality, but they continue to struggle for social security. That is some of the good practice, but also in the observatory that we have developed this experience of building of a letter of the women for the right to the women continues to be valid because it's a reference in any management. We have just national government, national elections. We've changed our authority after 12 years. We had a good relation, but now we've got the challenge to continue to position ourselves. We have done that in 2014, and that the processes of political advocacy continues because it's a way of advancing some drawbacks, but we always need to be organized. The organization is essential. Thank you. Thank you, Annelies, for all your comments. Well, very, very short round. I got a very, please, not more than 1 minute, because if not, I need to close interrupt you and really. And so, very small reaction, sadly, Jazmín. Yeah, something very, very fast. Actually, regarding the question that posed by my colleagues in the care, we was thinking a little bit about I'm working in the Ministry of Women, and what we're doing that there is to generate spaces of dialogue, in constant dialogue with the social organizations of women in order to recover the demands that they've got and being able to channel that and promote action from the ministry and from the state from regarding these demands, and that on the one side, and then we'll be able to map these organizations and see what kind of things they are doing, and make visible their work and make a mapping and making it making aware how we are trying to articulate, but these collective spaces with the presence of the government, the state, the local government, to listen and hear the demands and place them in the agenda of the government are different ways of actually to strengthen that link with the population to recover this trust and think the demands of the organizations from the point of view of the state. That's what I was thinking in order to offer recommendation for you to thinking. And then I can write to all of you to comment more. Thank you. Thank you, man. Jazmín, Ignacio, very fast comment, please. No, only just thank you for all these efforts and of linking the local to the with the civil society, to the different groups, the different representations, the different local institutions, and also the transnational institution. It's very important to understand and have very nice these lessons and the different kind of struggles of the different organizations. How can we actually exchange knowledge and articulate our things and continue to think in different ways that the LGBT, how we thinking about in the right to the city, how can we continue to dialogue with other collectives with these specific demands? It's not only that, and to highlight this effort that CLACSO are doing with the global platform for the right to the city and how much we still can do. Thank you, Ignacio. I don't know, Irene or Marta. Now, on our side, to say hello and to everybody and tell you that the role of women that we suffer different kinds of discrimination, as she was saying in the chat, is essentially in the construction of cities. Not only we need to validate what the public administrations do, but also what the civil society is doing. That because that is essential to eliminate barriers. That's it. And say, congratulate everything, and please send us your comments and contributions. Thank you, Irene. So here we've got the email. So please, as in order to close, Lorena Zárate is responsible for all the activities. Thank you very much. Thank you, Manuel, and all the colleagues, process that participated here. Has been very enriching, the exchange of presentation, questions, proposals. Anyway, let us try that. We are going to continue. We've still got an open space, this channel for listeners. We've got our details so that you can write us with contribution, your ideas. We've got in touch with some people who want to actually to have a revision of the draft, and we are going to send it to you. And these sessions are all recorded so that you can actually then use it afterwards and share it wherever you deem most useful. We've seen many subject matters actually being discussed. I want to put two comments. One, the context of the pandemic that was mentioned is something very relevant. As I told at the beginning, we've developed a specific document regarding the impact of the COVID and the right to the city. Last year, we're going to publish it at the end of the edition. But for this paper, it would be interesting to introduce some reflections from the point of view on how we have intensive, how the discrimination has grown based on the policies and programs that have been implemented. We know, for example, in some places, it was mentioned the impact this has had in Lima and Quito. But regarding policies of economical support, but sometimes they don't reach the informal sector, but they don't reach to women or LGBT populations or something, some reflection on how the context of COVID in the policies within the COVID didn't take into account this discrimination, this structural discrimination, but have even intensified even more. So Nelson was mentioning the relevance of the approach regarding discrimination, and he talked about the space. One is a spatial dimension. So where that discrimination actually happens, which sectors affect and how the place where they live and their origin space are also important factors that affect. And the other dimension is the social dimension that was talked, the collective dimension. And there's a level of discrimination of have not yet actually acknowledged and actually affect all these groups. So what do I mean by this? The social sector is all normally out of many of these discussions. Normally it's the private and the public sector, and the social aspect is not being touched, stigmatized, criminalized. So it's not being seen, it's made invisible, it's not acknowledged the supports that they have from the point of view of economy, education, health, everything that we have been discussing today. So that would be a very interesting contribution that could connect perfectly well with this collective dimension of the right to the city, how we've got a discrimination that actually is intersectional, but actually affects the social sector clearly in our countries with legislation that actually enable us to participate or give us access to resources that criminalize sectors of the civil society. And these actions actually within the right of the citizen, human rights, these are actions of stressing the right. So the state is not answered. We are actually claiming our rights. but and sometimes we are criminalized because of that, and that could be an element that could be add a interesting contribution regarding discrimination. Thank you very much to what we talked about the issue of youth, and that we're connected with the final announcement that is that the next week on the 22nd is the second session, fourth section of this cycle of dialogues of the right to the city. And that session will be focused in the issue of inclusive citizenship, mainly regarding youth. That we are going to have a presentation of articles included in the CLACSO notebook and a thematic paper that is help us to being developing in the subject matter. So please, you're all invited for the next week and continue to make contributions. These documents are individual, but are all connected or interlinked. So your contributions are very welcome. Thank you very much. Take care, and we see you soon.
Gracias, chao.
Cámara, pero les doy un abrazo fuerte. Chao, chao.